My husband dragged me to the gala to impress the new owner. "Stay in the back, your dress is embarrassing," he hissed. When the billionaire arrived, he ignored my husband's handshake. He walked straight to me, took my hands, and whispered with tears in his eyes, "I've been looking for you for 30 years. I still love you." My husband dropped his glass. "I'm glad to have you here. Follow my story until the end and comment the city you're watching from, so I can see how far my story has reached." I should have known Fletcher was planning something when he suddenly insisted I accompany him to the corporate gala. In 25 years of marriage, he had never once wanted me by his side at any business function. I was the wife who stayed home, who kept quiet, who made sure his shirts were pressed and his meals were ready when he returned from his important meetings with important people. "You're coming with me tonight," he announced that Tuesday morning, barely looking up from his Wall Street Journal. "The new CEO will be there. Morrison Industries just got bought out, and I need to make the right impression." I paused in refilling his coffee cup, the hot liquid trembling slightly in the pot. "Are you sure you want me there? I don't really have anything appropriate to wear to something that fancy." Fletcher's gray eyes flicked up at me with that familiar look of disdain. "Find something. Buy something cheap if you have to. Just don't embarrass me." Don't embarrass me. Those 3 words had been the soundtrack of our marriage for over 2 decades. Don't embarrass me by talking too much at dinner parties. Don't embarrass me by mentioning your family background. Don't embarrass me by existing too loudly in spaces where I wasn't wanted. I spent the rest of that week searching through thrift stores and discount shops with the $200 Fletcher gave me monthly for personal expenses. Everything had to come from that allowance. My clothes, my toiletries, even the small gifts I bought for his business associates' wives during holidays. After 25 years, I had become an expert at finding decent clothing for almost nothing. The dress I finally found was navy blue with long sleeves, modest but elegant. It had cost me $45 at a consignment shop, and the woman behind the counter assured me it had come from an expensive department store originally. I pressed it carefully and hung it in the back of my closet, trying not to think about how Fletcher would find something wrong with it anyway. The night of the gala arrived faster than I wanted. Fletcher emerged from his dressing room in a perfectly tailored black tuxedo that probably cost more than I spent on clothes in an entire year. His silver hair was slicked back, and he wore his father's gold watch, the one that reminded everyone he came from money, even if his business was drowning in debt. "You ready?" he asked, then stopped when he saw me. His face immediately darkened. "That's what you're wearing?" I looked down at my dress, suddenly seeing it through his eyes. What had seemed elegant in the store now felt shabby and outdated. "I thought it looked nice. It was the best I could find with the budget you gave me." Fletcher shook his head in disgust. "It'll have to do. Just try to stay in the background tonight. Don't draw attention to yourself. And for God's sake, don't talk about anything personal. These are serious business people." The ride to the Grand Hyatt downtown was silent except for the classical music Fletcher preferred and the occasional sound of him checking his phone. I sat beside him, my hands folded in my lap, touching the small silver locket at my throat without thinking. It was the only piece of jewelry I owned that Fletcher hadn't bought me, the only thing that was truly mine. I had worn it every day for 30 years, tucked beneath my clothes where no one could see it. The hotel ballroom was exactly what I expected. Crystal chandeliers, white tablecloths, and the kind of people who measured their worth in stock portfolios and vacation homes. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and fresh lilies, and everywhere I looked, women wore gowns that cost more than our monthly mortgage payment. "Stay here," Fletcher commanded, pointing to a spot near the bar where shadows from the decorative plants would hide me. "I need to find some people. Don't wander off." I nodded and watched him stride away, his shoulders straight with false confidence. I knew his business was struggling. I heard the phone calls late at night, the worried conversations about loans and deadlines and clients jumping ship. This gala was his desperate attempt to salvage something, to make connections that might save him from bankruptcy. I stood where he left me, nursing a glass of water and watching the crowd. Business executives laughed too loudly at each other's jokes. Their wives compared jewelry and vacation plans. Everyone seemed to know exactly where they belonged, while I felt like a shadow in my $45 dress. 20 minutes passed before I saw Fletcher across the room, gesticulating wildly to a group of men in expensive suits. His face was red with exertion, and I could see the desperation in his movements even from a distance. Whatever he was trying to sell them, they weren't buying it. Then the energy in the room shifted. Conversations quieted, and heads turned toward the main entrance. I craned my neck to see what was causing the commotion, and my breath caught in my throat. A tall man in an impeccably tailored tuxedo had entered the ballroom. His dark hair was touched with silver at the temples, and he moved with the quiet confidence that only comes from real power, not the desperate imitation of it. Even from across the room, there was something familiar about the way he carried himself, something that made my heart skip in a way it hadn't in decades. "That's him," someone whispered nearby. "That's Julian Blackwood, the new CEO." Julian. The name hit me like a physical blow. It couldn't be. After 30 years, it couldn't possibly be him. But as he turned slightly, scanning the crowd with those dark eyes I knew so well, I knew with absolute certainty that it was Julian Blackwood, the man I had loved with every fiber of my being when I was 22 years old, the man whose child I had carried for 3 months before losing everything, the man I had been forced to walk away from, leaving my heart buried in that college town where we had planned our entire future together. He was older now, distinguished in a way that spoke of success and power, but his face was the same. The strong jawline, the intense eyes that seemed to see straight through people, the way he held his head slightly tilted when he was thinking. My Julian, who wasn't mine anymore and hadn't been for 3 decades. I pressed myself further into the shadows, my heart pounding so hard I was sure people could hear it. What was he doing here? What were the chances that he would be the new CEO of the company Fletcher desperately needed to impress? Across the room, Fletcher spotted Julian and immediately began pushing through the crowd toward him. I watched in horror as my husband approached the man I had never stopped loving, his hand extended for a business handshake, his smile wide and predatory. Julian accepted the handshake politely, but I could see even from a distance that he wasn't really listening to whatever Fletcher was saying. His eyes were scanning the crowd, searching for something or someone. And then, as if drawn by some invisible force, his gaze found mine. The world stopped. For a moment that lasted an eternity, Julian Blackwood stared directly at me across that crowded ballroom. His face went completely white, and I saw his lips part in shock. The businessman facade crumbled, and for one heartbeat, he was 25 again, looking at me the way he used to look at me when we were young and believed that love could conquer anything. Then he was moving, walking straight toward me as if the 100 other people in that room didn't exist. Fletcher continued talking to empty air for several seconds before realizing that Julian was no longer listening. I saw my husband's confusion turn to alarm as he followed Julian's line of sight and realized he was heading directly for me. "Excuse me," Julian said to Fletcher without looking at him. His voice was deeper now, roughened by years and success, but it still made my knees weak. "I need to speak with your wife." Fletcher sputtered something about Julian making a mistake, about me being nobody important, but Julian wasn't listening. He walked straight to where I stood frozen in the shadows, stopped just close enough that I could smell his cologne. Something expensive and sophisticated, nothing like the aftershave he used to wear in college. "Maureen?" he said, and my name on his lips after 30 years made my eyes fill with tears I hadn't given myself permission to shed. "Julian," I whispered back, barely able to find my voice. Without hesitation, he reached out and took both my hands in his, the same way he used to do when we were young. His hands were warm and steady, and I could feel the weight of his wedding ring, or rather the absence of it. His ring finger was bare. "I've been looking for you for 30 years, he said, his voice thick with emotion. His dark eyes were bright with unshed tears, and when he spoke again, his words carried across the suddenly silent ballroom. "I still love you." The sound of Fletcher's champagne glass hitting the marble floor echoed like a gunshot through the stunned silence that followed. Julian's words hung in the air between us like a bridge I wasn't sure I was brave enough to cross. Around us, the gala had effectively stopped. Conversations died mid-sentence as the city's most powerful people stared at the scene unfolding before them. I could feel their curiosity burning into my skin, but all I could see was Julian's face, older and more weathered than the boy I had loved, but unmistakably him. "This is ridiculous." Fletcher's voice cut through the moment like a blade. He stepped between Julian and me, his face flushed with humiliation and rage. "Maureen, what the hell is going on here?" I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. How could I explain 30 years of buried heartache in front of a room full of strangers? How could I tell my husband that he had never been anything more than a refuge from the pain of losing the only man I had ever truly loved? Julian's eyes never left my face. "Could we speak privately?" he asked, his voice gentle but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Fletcher laughed harshly. "Privately? She's my wife. Anything you have to say to her, you can say in front of me." "No," Julian said simply. "I can't." The weight of his gaze was almost unbearable. I could see the questions there, the hurt that time hadn't healed, the love that had somehow survived 3 decades of separation. But I could also see Fletcher's panic, the way his hands shook as he realized that his carefully planned evening was crumbling around him. "Julian," I finally managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper, "I can't. Not here. Not like this." He nodded slowly, understanding in a way that Fletcher never had. "Of course. But Maureen—" He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a business card, white with silver embossing. "Please, call me. We need to talk." I took the card with trembling fingers, our hands brushing for just a moment. The contact sent electricity through my entire body, a reminder of what it felt like to be touched with love instead of possession. "We're leaving," Fletcher announced loudly, grabbing my arm with enough force to bruise. "Now." Julian's expression darkened as he saw Fletcher's grip on me, and for a moment I thought he might intervene. But I shook my head slightly and he stepped back, his jaw clenched with obvious effort. "I'll be waiting for your call," he said quietly. Fletcher dragged me through the ballroom, past the staring faces and whispered speculations. I clutched Julian's business card in my free hand, the sharp edges pressing into my palm like a lifeline. The ride home was a nightmare of Fletcher's rage and accusations, but I barely heard him. My mind was spinning backward through time, to a small college town where I had been young and fearless and desperately in love. Julian and I met in our junior year at Colorado State. I was studying literature on a partial scholarship, working 3 jobs to pay for everything my financial aid didn't cover. He was in business school, brilliant and ambitious, but also kind in a way that surprised me. Rich boys weren't supposed to notice scholarship girls like me, but Julian did. Our first conversation happened in the library during finals week. I was stretched across 3 chairs, surrounded by textbooks and empty coffee cups, when he approached with that slightly tilted head that meant he was thinking hard about something. "You look like you could use some real food," he said, and his voice was warm with amusement. "The cafeteria closes in 20 minutes, but I know a place that stays open late. 24-hour diner with the best pie in town." I looked up from my Victorian literature textbook, ready to politely decline. I didn't have money for late-night dinners, and I certainly didn't have time for whatever game rich boys played with girls like me. But when I met his eyes, dark and serious and completely sincere, something inside me shifted. "I can't afford diners," I said honestly, "but thank you." "I didn't ask if you could afford it," he replied gently. I asked if you were hungry. That was Julian. Direct, honest, cutting through pretense to get to the heart of things. We went to the diner that night, and he bought me apple pie and listened while I talked about books and dreams and the scholarship I was desperately trying not to lose. He didn't try to impress me with stories about his family's money or his future plans. He just listened, really listened, in a way no one ever had before. We became inseparable after that. Julian introduced me to his world of cocktail parties and country clubs, but he also slipped away from those gatherings to explore my world of midnight study sessions and shared pizza in tiny dorm rooms. We talked about everything: literature and business, family and dreams, the future we were building together piece by careful piece. The night he proposed was perfect in its simplicity. We were sitting in our favorite spot by the campus lake, watching the sunset over the mountains. Julian pulled out his grandmother's emerald ring, antique and beautiful, and his hands shook as he slipped it onto my finger. "Marry me, Maureen," he said, and his voice was thick with emotion. "I want to spend the rest of my life making you happy." I said yes without hesitation. We were 22 and believed that love was enough to overcome any obstacle. We made plans for a small ceremony after graduation, a honeymoon in Europe, the apartment we would share while Julian finished his MBA. Everything seemed possible when you were 22 and in love. But Julian's parents had different plans. Charles and Victoria Blackwood were old Denver money, the kind of people who measured relationships in terms of social advantage and business connections. When they learned about Julian's engagement to a scholarship student from a middle-class family, their response was swift and brutal. They threatened to cut Julian off completely. No more tuition money, no trust fund, no place in the family business empire they had spent generations building. But worse than that, they threatened to destroy my scholarship, my future, everything I had worked so hard to achieve. Charles Blackwood had connections everywhere, including the university administration. One word from him, and I would lose everything. "They can't do this," Julian said when he told me about their ultimatum. We were in his apartment, and his face was white with fury. "I'll fight them. I'll give up the money, the business, all of it. We'll make our own way." But I was already pregnant with his child, though I hadn't told him yet. I had discovered it 3 days earlier, sitting on the bathroom floor of my dorm with a plastic test strip in my shaking hands. I was 22 and terrified and desperately in love with a man whose family would destroy us both rather than accept me. That night, I made the hardest decision of my life. I broke up with Julian without telling him about the baby. I gave him back his grandmother's ring and walked away from everything we had built together. I told him I had realized we were too different, that I didn't want the life he was offering me. I watched his heart break in real time, saw the confusion and pain in his eyes, and I nearly crumbled, but I held firm. I let him believe I had stopped loving him rather than tell him the truth, that his parents' threats had terrified me, that I was carrying his child, that I was sacrificing our future to protect him from having to choose between me and everything he had ever known. 3 weeks later, I lost the baby. A miscarriage at 8 weeks, sudden and devastating. I bled alone in a hospital emergency room, grieving not just for the child I had lost, but for the future that was already gone. Julian tried to reach out during those weeks, but I couldn't bear to see him. I couldn't bear to tell him that I had destroyed us for nothing, that the child we would have had together was gone. When Fletcher Morrison asked me to marry him 6 months later, I said yes. Fletcher was safe, predictable, completely different from Julian in every way that mattered. He wasn't the love of my life, but he offered security and a way to start over. I thought I could learn to love him, or at least to find contentment in the life he was offering. I was wrong about that, as I was wrong about so many things. Fletcher turned out to be controlling in ways that took years to fully understand. It started small. Suggestions about my clothes, my friends, the way I spoke in public. Gradually, those suggestions became demands, then ultimatums. He isolated me from my college friends, convinced me that my family was beneath his social circle, made me financially dependent on his monthly allowance. What I had mistaken for protection was actually possession. For 25 years, I had lived as Fletcher's wife, playing the role he had scripted for me. I learned to be quiet at dinner parties, to dress appropriately for his business functions, to ask permission before spending money or making plans. I became the kind of woman who apologized for existing too loudly in spaces where I wasn't wanted. But I never forgot Julian. I carried our love story inside me like a secret wound that never quite healed. I kept his grandmother's emerald ring hidden in my jewelry box, though I told myself I would return it someday when the pain wasn't so sharp. I read the business news religiously, following his career from a distance as he built his own empire without his parents' help. I celebrated his successes and mourned his failures from afar, always wondering if he ever thought of me. Now, sitting in Fletcher's car as he raged about the humiliation I had caused him, I clutched Julian's business card and felt something I hadn't experienced in decades. Hope. Whatever had brought him back into my life, whatever cosmic joke or cruel twist of fate had made him the new CEO of Fletcher's most important client, it felt like a second chance I had never dared to dream of. The business card felt like fire in my hands as I sat in our bedroom that night, staring at the simple white rectangle with silver embossing. Julian Blackwood, Chief Executive Officer, Blackwood Industries. A phone number, an email address. 30 years of separation reduced to a few lines of text. Fletcher had locked himself in his study after we returned from the gala, and I could hear him on the phone with his business partners, his voice rising and falling in desperate explanations. The walls in our house were thick, but not thick enough to muffle his panic. Everything had been riding on tonight's meeting with the new CEO, and instead of securing a contract, he had watched his wife's past explode into his present like a bomb. I should have told him years ago. Should have mentioned, casually over breakfast or during one of our silent dinners, that I had once known someone named Julian Blackwood. But how do you explain that you married one man while still desperately in love with another? How do you admit that 25 years of marriage has been built on the foundation of a broken heart? I pulled out the small wooden jewelry box I kept hidden in the back of my closet. Beneath winter sweaters Fletcher never noticed. My fingers found the familiar weight of the emerald ring Julian had given me when we were 22 and believed in forever. I had never returned it, though I told myself for years that I would find a way to get it back to him. The truth was simpler and more painful. It was the only piece of our love story I had been allowed to keep. The ring caught the lamplight, throwing tiny green reflections across my palm. Julian's grandmother's ring, passed down through 4 generations of Blackwood women. He had been so nervous when he proposed, his hand shaking as he slipped it onto my finger beside the campus lake where we used to study together on warm afternoons. "It's been waiting for the right woman," he had said that night, his dark eyes serious and full of love. "It's been waiting for you." I had worn it for exactly 3 months before everything fell apart. The memory of that afternoon in Charles Blackwood's office was still sharp enough to make my hands tremble. Julian's father had summoned me to the downtown Denver high-rise where Blackwood Industries was headquartered, and I had gone expecting to discuss wedding plans. Instead, I found myself sitting across from a man whose cold eyes and calculating smile made my skin crawl. "Miss Campbell," he had said, leaning back in his leather chair like a predator who had cornered his prey. "I understand my son has made you certain promises." I had lifted my chin, trying to project a confidence I didn't feel. At 22, I thought courage was enough to overcome anything. "Julian and I are engaged. We're planning to marry after graduation." Charles Blackwood laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth. "Are you? How interesting. Tell me, what do you imagine married life will be like? The country club memberships, the charity galas, the summers in the Hamptons? Do you think you'll fit into our world, Miss Campbell?" "I think love is more important than social status," I replied, though my voice had begun to waver. "Love." He repeated the word like it tasted bitter. Let me tell you about love, Miss Campbell. Love is a luxury that people in my family can't afford. Julian has responsibilities. To this company, to our family name, to the legacy that spans 4 generations. He will marry someone who can support those responsibilities, not someone who will drag them down. I started to argue, but he held up a hand for silence. You're on a partial academic scholarship, aren't you? Majoring in literature with a minor in education. Your father works in construction. Your mother is a secretary at an insurance company. Middle-class people, I'm sure they're very nice, but hardly the background we expect for a Blackwood daughter-in-law. Each word was precisely chosen to cut, and they found their mark. I felt my face burn with shame and anger, but Charles Blackwood wasn't finished. I've done my research, Miss Campbell. One phone call from me to the right people at Colorado State, and your scholarship disappears. Your grades are excellent, but there are plenty of excellent students who need financial aid. Without that scholarship, you'll have to drop out, won't you? All those dreams of becoming a teacher, of making something of yourself, gone. My mouth had gone dry. The scholarship was everything to me. Without it, I would have to leave school, probably forever. My parents couldn't afford to pay for my education, and I was already working 3 jobs just to cover living expenses. But that's not all, Charles continued, his smile growing wider. Julian thinks he's ready to give up his trust fund for you, to make his own way in the world. Young love, very romantic. But what he doesn't understand is that I can make sure he fails. Every door he tries to open, I can close. Every job he applies for, every business loan he needs. I have connections everywhere, Miss Campbell. I can ensure that Julian Blackwood becomes just another college graduate with an expensive education and no prospects. I sat frozen in my chair, understanding for the first time the true scope of the Blackwood family's power. This wasn't just about money or social status. This was about complete and utter destruction. So here's what's going to happen, Charles said, leaning forward across his massive mahogany desk. You're going to break up with my son. You're going to tell him you've realized the 2 of you are incompatible, that you want different things from life. You're going to give him back his grandmother's ring and walk away. And in return, I'll make sure you graduate with your scholarship intact. I might even put in a good word for you with some local school districts when you're ready to start your teaching career. The offer was both generous and terrible in its cynical calculation. He was buying me off, but he was also offering me the only chance I had to finish my education and build a life for myself. And if I refuse, I asked, though I already knew the answer. Then you'll both be destroyed. Julian will never forgive himself for ruining your future, and you'll never forgive yourself for ruining his. Either way, your relationship won't survive. This way, at least one of you gets to keep your dreams. I should have told Julian everything, should have run straight to him and confessed what his father had threatened. But I was 22 and terrified and carrying a secret I hadn't shared with anyone. I was pregnant with Julian's child. I had discovered it 3 days before that meeting with Charles Blackwood, sitting on the cold bathroom floor of my dorm room with a plastic pregnancy test in my shaking hands. 2 pink lines that changed everything. I had planned to tell Julian that weekend, had imagined his face lighting up with joy and wonder. We had talked about children, about the family we would build together someday. Someday had arrived sooner than we expected, but we loved each other enough to handle anything. Except Charles Blackwood's threats weren't directed just at us anymore. They were directed at our unborn child, at the future we were already creating together. If I refused his ultimatum, he would destroy Julian's career prospects, eliminate my education, and ensure that our baby would be born into poverty and struggle. I made the decision that haunts me still. I chose to sacrifice our love to protect our child's future. The breakup was the hardest thing I had ever done. I met Julian at our favorite coffee shop near campus, the one where we had spent countless hours studying together and planning our future. He was already there when I arrived, sitting at our usual table by the window, and his face lit up when he saw me the way it always did. "There's my beautiful fiancé," he said, standing to kiss me. How did the meeting with my father go? I hope he wasn't too intimidating. He can be a little intense when it comes to business. I couldn't look at him directly. Instead, I stared at the engagement ring on my left hand, the emerald catching the afternoon sunlight streaming through the window. We need to talk, Julian. Something in my tone must have warned him, because his smile faded immediately. What's wrong? I forced myself to meet his eyes, these dark eyes that had looked at me with such love and tenderness for the past year. I've been thinking about our engagement, about what marriage would mean. Okay. He sat down slowly, wariness creeping into his expression. What about it? I don't think we're right for each other. The lie tasted like poison in my mouth. We want different things from life. Julian stared at me for a long moment, confusion and hurt warring across his face. What are you talking about? Maureen, we've planned everything together. We want the same things. No, we don't. I pulled the ring off my finger, the metal sliding easily over my knuckle. It had been loose lately, probably because I had been too nervous to eat much since discovering the pregnancy. I've realized that I'm not cut out for your world. The country clubs, the social expectations, the pressure to be someone I'm not. I want something simpler. Then we'll have something simpler, Julian said immediately, reaching across the table for my hands. Maureen, I don't care about any of that. We can live however you want to live. I pulled my hands away before his touch could weaken my resolve. It's not just about how we live. It's about who we are. You're going to inherit your family's business someday. You'll need a wife who can support that world, who understands it. I'm not that person. You're exactly that person, Julian insisted, his voice rising with desperation. You're intelligent, beautiful, kind. You're everything I want in a wife, in a partner. Maureen, where is this coming from? Last week you were excited about looking at apartments for next year. What changed? Everything, I wanted to say. Everything changed when your father showed me exactly what your family is capable of. When I realized that loving you isn't enough to protect the child growing inside me. Instead, I placed the emerald ring on the table between us, the small click of metal against wood sounding like a gunshot in the quiet coffee shop. I'm giving you back your ring. Julian stared at the ring as if it were a poisonous snake. No, Maureen, this is crazy. Whatever's wrong, we can fix it. We love each other. Love isn't always enough, I said quietly, hating myself for the truth in those words. It is for us, Julian said fiercely. It has to be. I stood up before I could lose my nerve entirely. I'm sorry, Julian. I truly am. But this is for the best. For the best? Julian shot to his feet, his chair scraping against the floor. How is breaking up for the best? Maureen, talk to me. Tell me what's really going on here. For one terrible moment, I almost did. Almost told him about his father's threats, about the pregnancy, about the impossible choice I was being forced to make. But Charles Blackwood's warning echoed in my mind. Julian would never forgive himself for ruining my future, and I would never forgive myself for ruining his. Goodbye, Julian, I whispered, and walked away from the only man I had ever loved. 3 weeks later, I lost the baby. I was alone when it happened, cramping and bleeding in my small dorm room on a rainy Thursday morning. By the time I made it to the campus health center, it was already over. 8 weeks of pregnancy ended as quickly and quietly as it had begun. These things happen sometimes, the doctor told me gently, often in the first trimester. It doesn't mean anything was wrong with you, or that you can't have healthy pregnancies in the future. But I knew the truth. I had sacrificed my relationship with Julian to protect a child who was already gone. I had destroyed our love for nothing. Julian tried to contact me during those weeks, leaving messages I didn't return, showing up at places he knew I would be. I avoided him with the skill of someone whose heart was too shattered to risk further breaking. Eventually, he stopped trying. Eventually, he graduated and moved away, and I never saw him again. Until tonight. 6 months after our breakup, Fletcher Morrison asked me to marry him. Fletcher was a business acquaintance of my father's, 12 years older than me, and nothing like Julian in any way. He was stable, predictable, completely safe. When I said yes, it wasn't because I loved him. It was because I was tired of being alone with my grief, tired of turning down Julian's grandmother's ring every night before bed. I thought I could learn to love Fletcher. I thought that safety and security might be enough to build a life on. I was wrong about that, as I had been wrong about so many things. Now, 25 years later, I sat in the bedroom of the house Fletcher had bought to showcase his success, holding Julian's business card and his grandmother's ring, and wondering if second chances were real or just cruel jokes the universe played on people who had already lost everything that mattered. Tomorrow, I would have to decide whether to call the number on that white card, whether to open a door I had closed 3 decades ago, when I was young and pregnant and terrified enough to believe that love wasn't worth fighting for. The question was whether I was brave enough now to discover what might have been different if I had chosen to fight instead of run. I spent 3 sleepless nights staring at Julian's business card before I found the courage to call. Each time I picked up the phone, Fletcher's voice echoed in my mind with all the reasons I shouldn't, all the ways this would destroy the carefully constructed life we had built together. But lying awake at 3 in the morning, I realized that carefully constructed was just another way of saying completely hollow. On Thursday morning, Fletcher left early for a golf meeting with potential investors, desperate men like himself, trying to save sinking businesses with handshakes and false promises. I waited until I heard his car pull out of the driveway before I walked to the kitchen phone, my hands trembling as I dialed the number embossed in silver on that white card. Blackwood Industries, Mr. Blackwood's office, a professional female voice answered. This is? I paused, realizing I didn't know how to identify myself. I wasn't Julian's college girlfriend anymore. I wasn't his lost love. I was Fletcher Morrison's wife, calling a man who had declared his feelings for me in front of a ballroom full of Denver's most influential people. This is Maureen Morrison. Mr. Blackwood asked me to call. There was a brief silence, then the voice became noticeably warmer. Of course, Mrs. Morrison. Mr. Blackwood has been expecting your call. Can you hold for just one moment? The wait felt eternal. I gripped the phone so tightly my knuckles went white, listening to classical music that reminded me of the concerts Julian and I used to attend when we were students. He had introduced me to Mozart and Beethoven, sitting beside me in the university auditorium, and watching my face as I discovered the beauty of symphonies I had never had the opportunity to hear before. Maureen. His voice came through the line like a caress, the same way he used to say my name when we were alone together in his apartment, wrapped in each other's arms and talking about our future. Thank you for calling. I almost didn't, I admitted, surprising myself with my honesty. I'm not sure this is wise. Wise has nothing to do with it, Julian said softly. Some things are just necessary. Can you meet me for coffee? Somewhere we can talk without interruption? I understood his meaning. Somewhere Fletcher wouldn't find us, wouldn't cause another scene like the one at the gala. There's a small cafe on 16th Street, the Blue Moon. Do you know it? I'll find it. Can you be there in an hour? An hour. 60 minutes to decide whether I was brave enough to see him again, to sit across from him and hear whatever he needed to say. 60 minutes to choose between the life I knew and the possibility of something I had thought was lost forever. I'll be there, I said, and hung up before I could change my mind. The Blue Moon Cafe was tucked between a bookstore and a vintage clothing shop, the kind of place where artists and students nursed single cups of coffee for hours while working on novels or studying for exams. I had discovered it years ago during one of my rare solo outings, and I came here sometimes when Fletcher's control felt too suffocating, when I needed to remember that there was a world beyond our marble-floored house where people laughed freely and talked about ideas instead of stock portfolios. I arrived 15 minutes early and chose a table in the back corner, where shadows from the exposed brick walls would provide some privacy. The cafe smelled like roasted coffee beans and cinnamon pastries, and the low murmur of conversation created a cocoon of anonymity. I ordered a latte I didn't want and watched the door, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird. Julian arrived exactly on time, scanning the room until his eyes found mine. He looked different in the daylight streaming through the cafe windows. Older, yes, but also more substantial somehow. The boy I had loved had grown into a man who commanded attention without demanding it, who wore authority like a well-tailored suit. But when he smiled at me, really smiled for the first time since that night at the gala, I saw traces of the 22-year-old who had proposed to me beside a campus lake. "You look beautiful," he said as he sat down across from me, and I felt heat rise in my cheeks. Fletcher hadn't called me beautiful in years. Pretty, maybe, when I was dressed appropriately for one of his business functions. Acceptable, presentable, never beautiful. "You look successful," I replied, deflecting the compliment because I didn't know how to accept it anymore. Julian's smile faded slightly. "Success isn't the same thing as happiness, Maureen. I learned that the hard way." A waitress appeared to take Julian's order. Black coffee, the same way he used to drink it in college when we stayed up all night studying together. After she left, an awkward silence stretched between us, filled with 30 years of unspoken words and unanswered questions. "Why did you leave?" Julian asked finally, his voice quiet but direct. "The real reason, not the story about us wanting different things." I never believed that, not for 1 second. I had rehearsed this conversation in my mind for 3 days, trying to find words that would explain without revealing too much. But sitting across from him, seeing the pain that still lived in his dark eyes after all these years, I found myself telling him everything. I told him about his father's threats, about the meeting in that cold downtown office where Charles Blackwood had laid out exactly how he would destroy both our futures if I didn't walk away. I told him about the pregnancy I had hidden from everyone, about losing the baby 3 weeks after our breakup, about marrying Fletcher because I was tired of grieving alone. Julian listened without interrupting, his face growing paler with each revelation. When I finished, he sat in stunned silence for a long moment, his hands clenched into fists on the small cafe table. "My father threatened you," he said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "And you were pregnant. With my child." I nodded, unable to trust my voice. "Jesus Christ, Maureen." Julian ran both hands through his hair, a gesture I remembered from when he was overwhelmed or frustrated. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you come to me with this?" "Because I was 22 and terrified," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Because your father convinced me that loving you would destroy both of us. Because I thought I was protecting you. Protecting me." Julian laughed, but there was no humor in it. "You protected me by breaking my heart and disappearing from my life. You protected me by letting me believe for 30 years that I wasn't good enough to keep you." The pain in his voice was unbearable. I reached across the table instinctively, covering his clenched fist with my hand. "Julian, I'm so sorry. I thought I was doing the right thing." He turned his hand palm up, capturing my fingers in his. His touch was warm and familiar, even after 3 decades. "My father died 5 years ago," he said quietly. "I spent the last 15 years of his life trying to earn his approval, trying to prove I could build something without his help. I never knew about the threats, never knew what he did to you." "It doesn't matter now," I said, though we both knew that was a lie. It mattered more than ever, because understanding the past was the only way to make sense of the present. "It matters to me," Julian said firmly. "It matters because I need you to know that I never stopped loving you. Not when you left, not when you married Fletcher, not when I married Catherine because my parents insisted I needed a suitable wife for appearances. I searched for you, Maureen. For years I hired investigators, followed leads that went nowhere. I never gave up hope that someday I would find you again. My heart clenched at the pain in his confession. Julian. I divorced Catherine 3 years ago, he continued. Amicable, no children, no real love lost on either side. We both knew we had married for the wrong reasons. And then, last month, I finally found you. My investigators tracked down your marriage records, your address. I was planning to approach you carefully, diplomatically. I never imagined I would walk into that gala and see you standing there like something out of a dream. The weight of his words settled between us like a promise and a threat. He had found me, had been planning to contact me, had been searching for 30 years. The life I had built with Fletcher, the carefully maintained routine of our marriage, the safety I had thought I needed, all of it suddenly felt as fragile as tissue paper. What happens now? I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Julian's hand tightened around mine. That depends on you. I know you're married. I know this is complicated. But Maureen, I also know that what we had was real, and I don't think it ever really died. Not for me, and I don't think for you either. He was right, and we both knew it. Sitting across from him in that small cafe, I could feel the pull between us as strongly as I had when we were 22 and believed that love could conquer anything. But I wasn't 22 anymore. I was 57 and married to a man who controlled every aspect of my life, who would never let me go without a fight. Fletcher will never give me a divorce, I said quietly. Not willingly. He sees me as a possession, not a person, and he needs my compliance to maintain his image, especially now when his business is struggling. Then don't ask his permission, Julian said simply. Leave him. Come work for me. I'll make sure you're protected financially and legally. The offer hung in the air between us, tempting and terrifying in equal measure. A job would give me independence, a way to support myself without Fletcher's monthly allowance. Working for Julian would give me a reason to see him every day, to rebuild whatever connection still existed between us. But it would also mean war with Fletcher, who would see my employment by Julian as the ultimate betrayal. I need time to think, I said, though part of me wanted to say yes immediately, wanted to walk out of that cafe and into a new life without looking back. Julian nodded, understanding as always. Take all the time you need. But Maureen. He pulled out another business card, this one with his personal cell phone number written on the back. Don't disappear on me again. Whatever you decide, don't just vanish. I can't go through that again. I took the card, our fingers brushing once more. I won't disappear, I promised, and meant it. We sat in comfortable silence for a few more minutes, drinking coffee that had grown cold while we excavated the ruins of our past. When Julian finally stood to leave, he leaned down and kissed my cheek gently, the same way he used to when we were students and he was walking me back to my dorm after long study sessions in the library. I'll be waiting, he said softly, for however long it takes. I watched him leave, this man who had loved me for 30 years without knowing why I had left him. The cafe suddenly felt empty without his presence, as if all the light had gone out of the room. I sat alone with my cold coffee and tried to imagine what my life might look like if I was brave enough to choose love over safety, possibility over routine. The drive home was a blur of Denver traffic and racing thoughts. I kept Julian's business card in my purse, next to the first one he had given me at the gala, and I could feel them there like a secret heartbeat. By the time I pulled into our driveway, I had almost convinced myself that I could do it, that I could tell Fletcher I was leaving, that I was taking a job with Julian's company, that our marriage was over. But Fletcher was waiting for me in the kitchen when I walked through the door, and one look at his face told me that my decision might not be mine to make after all. "Where have you been?" he demanded, his voice sharp with suspicion and barely contained rage. "I went for coffee," I said carefully, hanging my purse on the hook by the door and trying to project casual innocence. Just needed to get out of the house for a while. Coffee. Fletcher repeated the word like it was a foreign concept. For 3 hours. I had been gone longer than I realized. Time moved differently when you were excavating 30 years of buried feelings, trying to make sense of choices that had shaped your entire adult life. I ran some errands afterward, I lied smoothly. Groceries, dry cleaning, the usual things. Fletcher stepped closer, his gray eyes scanning my face for signs of deception. Groceries, he said. Then where are they? My stomach dropped. I had been so consumed with thoughts of Julian, so overwhelmed by our conversation, that I had driven straight home without stopping anywhere. I forgot to pick them up. I was distracted, thinking about other things. What other things? Fletcher's voice was dangerously quiet now, the tone he used when he was trying to control his temper in public. What could possibly be so important that you forgot to do the one thing you told me you were going out to do? I could see the trap closing around me, could feel Fletcher's suspicion crystallizing into something more dangerous. He had always been jealous, possessive, but the encounter with Julian at the gala had triggered something primal in him. He knew he was losing control, and a man like Fletcher would do anything to maintain his grip on what he considered his property. Nothing important, I said quietly, hating myself for the familiar capitulation. I'm sorry. I'll go back out and get the groceries now. No. Fletcher grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh hard enough to leave bruises. You're not going anywhere. Not today, not tomorrow, not until I figure out what the hell is going on with you and Julian Blackwood. For a moment, we stared at each other in the marble-floored kitchen of the house Fletcher had bought to showcase his success. I could see my reflection in his eyes, and what I saw there wasn't a wife or a partner or even a person. What I saw was a possession that had dared to develop a will of its own, and Fletcher Morrison had never been the kind of man who tolerated disobedience. That's when I knew, with crystal clarity, that choosing Julian wasn't just about love or second chances or healing old wounds. It was about survival. Because staying with Fletcher would slowly kill every part of me that was still alive, and I had already given him 25 years of my life. Fletcher's grip on my arm tightened until I winced, and I saw something flicker across his face. Satisfaction at my pain. It was a look I had seen before, though I had always told myself I was imagining it. Fletcher Morrison took pleasure in my discomfort, in my compliance, in the small ways he could demonstrate his power over me. Let go of me, I said quietly, testing the waters of rebellion for the first time in 25 years. Or what? Fletcher's smile was cold, predatory. You'll call your boyfriend? You'll run to Julian Blackwood and tell him how mean your husband is being? The mockery in his voice was designed to make me feel foolish, childish, as if my feelings were nothing more than a ridiculous fantasy. It was a technique he had perfected over the years: dismiss, diminish, and control. But something had shifted in me since sitting across from Julian in that cafe, since learning the truth about why our love had been destroyed. Let go of me, I repeated, my voice stronger this time. Fletcher studied my face for a long moment, then released my arm with enough force to make me stumble backward. You think you're in love, he said, his voice dripping with disdain. 57 years old and acting like a teenager with her first crush. It's pathetic, Maureen. Truly pathetic. I rubbed the red marks his fingers had left on my arm, marks that would be purple bruises by tomorrow. What's pathetic is a man who has to hurt his wife to feel powerful. The words came out before I could stop them, and I saw Fletcher's face go white with rage. In 25 years of marriage, I had never spoken to him like that, had never challenged his authority so directly. We both knew something fundamental had changed between us, and there would be no going back to the careful dance of dominance and submission that had defined our relationship. You want to know about pathetic? Fletcher said, his voice low and dangerous. Let me tell you about pathetic. Julian Blackwood spent 30 years looking for you. 30 years of private investigators and false leads and desperate searches. And do you know what's really pathetic? I've known where you were the entire time. The words hit me like a physical blow. What? Fletcher laughed, a sound devoid of any warmth or humor. You heard me. I knew Julian was looking for you. I knew about the investigators, the inquiries, the background checks. I made sure every trail went cold, every lead went nowhere. I protected you from him, Maureen. I kept him away from our marriage, from our life. I stared at my husband, this man I had lived with for a quarter of a century, and realized I didn't know him at all. You? You knew he was searching for me? Of course I knew. Julian Blackwood isn't exactly subtle about anything he does. Money talks, sweetheart, and his investigators weren't particularly discreet about their inquiries. Fletcher straightened his tie, a gesture that usually signaled his return to civilized behavior, but his eyes remained cold and calculating. The first inquiry came about 6 months after we were married. Some private detective calling around, asking questions about you. It didn't take much to figure out who was behind it. My legs felt weak, and I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter for support. You never told me. Why would I tell you? So you could go running back to your college boyfriend? So you could destroy our marriage for some romantic fantasy? Fletcher shook his head dismissively. I protected our relationship, Maureen. I protected you from making a terrible mistake. You protected yourself, I said, understanding flooding through me like ice water. You knew that if Julian found me, if he told me the truth about why we broke up, I would leave you. Fletcher's smile was sharp as a blade. And would you have? If Julian had shown up at our door 10 years ago, 20 years ago, would you have left me for him? The honest answer was yes, and we both knew it. Even in the depths of my unhappiness with Fletcher, even during the years when our marriage felt like a prison sentence I was serving for crimes I didn't remember committing, I would have left him for Julian without hesitation. Fletcher had known that, had counted on my ignorance to keep me trapped. How? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. How did you stop the investigators? Money, mostly, bribes, false information, dead ends. It's amazing what people will do for the right price. Fletcher poured himself a glass of scotch from the bottle he kept on the kitchen counter, his movements casual and unconcerned, as if we were discussing the weather instead of 30 years of systematic manipulation. I had connections too, Maureen. Business associates who owed me favors, who could make problems disappear for the right consideration. I thought about Julian sitting across from me in that cafe, telling me how he had searched for years, how he had never given up hope of finding me. All those years of investigation, of following leads that went nowhere, of hiring detective after detective who fed him false information because my husband was paying them to lie. You destroyed his life too, I realized with growing horror. You didn't just keep him away from me. You tortured him for 30 years, making him believe I didn't want to be found. I saved his life, Fletcher corrected coldly. Julian Blackwood was obsessed with you, Maureen, completely obsessed. If I hadn't intervened, he would have wasted his entire future chasing after a woman who had already moved on, already chosen a different path. I never chose you, I said, the truth spilling out like poison from an old wound. I settled for you. I married you because I was broken and alone and thought I didn't deserve better. But I never chose you, Fletcher. Not really. For the first time in our conversation, Fletcher looked genuinely hurt. Not angry or calculating or controlling, but actually wounded by my words. 25 years of marriage, he said quietly. 25 years of providing for you, protecting you, giving you everything you could possibly need. And this is what I get in return? Contempt? You call it providing, I said, my voice growing stronger with each word. I call it buying compliance. You gave me a house and an allowance and a role to play, but you never gave me choice. You never gave me freedom. You never even gave me the basic respect of honesty. Honesty? Fletcher laughed bitterly. You want honesty? Here's some honesty for you. Julian Blackwood doesn't love you, Maureen. He loves the memory of you, the fantasy of who you were when you were 22. He's been chasing a ghost for 30 years, and when he realizes that the woman standing in front of him now isn't the girl he remembers, he'll disappear just as quickly as he appeared. The words were designed to hurt, to make me doubt myself and Julian and the possibility of a different life. But instead of weakening my resolve, Fletcher's cruelty only strengthened it, because I knew, deep in my bones, that he was wrong. Julian hadn't fallen in love with my 22-year-old self again at that gala. He had looked at me as I was now, 57 and tired and marked by years of emotional abuse, and he had still said he loved me. You're wrong, I said simply. Am I? Let me ask you something, Maureen. When Julian realizes that you're not the sweet college girl he remembered, when he sees how you've let yourself go, how you've become exactly the kind of middle-aged housewife he would never have chosen for himself, do you really think he'll still want you? I looked at my husband, this man who had spent 25 years systematically destroying my self-confidence, and I felt something snap inside me like a taut wire finally breaking under too much pressure. You know what, Fletcher? I don't care if Julian wants me or not. I don't care if he changes his mind tomorrow and decides you're right about everything, because at least he gave me a choice. At least he offered me the chance to decide for myself what I wanted, instead of manipulating and controlling me into compliance. I pulled Julian's business cards out of my purse, both of them, and set them on the kitchen counter between us like a declaration of war. Julian offered me a job, financial independence, the chance to build a life that belongs to me, not to some man who thinks he owns me. Fletcher's face went very still. You're not taking that job. Yes, I am. No, Maureen, you're not. Fletcher's voice dropped to the dangerous quiet tone he used when he was about to make threats. Because if you try to leave me, if you try to go work for Julian Blackwood or anyone else, I will destroy you financially. I will make sure you get nothing in any divorce settlement. I will tie you up in court for years until you're too old and too poor to start over. There it was. The truth about our marriage laid bare. Not love, not partnership, not even affection. Just ownership and control, backed by the threat of economic destruction. Fletcher had never loved me. He had collected me, the same way he collected expensive art and vintage wines, as a symbol of his success and good taste. You can try, I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. But Julian has more money and better lawyers than you'll ever have. And unlike you, he doesn't need to destroy people to feel powerful. The mention of Julian's superior resources hit Fletcher like a physical blow. His face flushed red, and I could see the vein in his temple throbbing with suppressed rage. Fletcher Morrison hated being reminded that he was nouveau riche, that his money and status were recent acquisitions built on leveraged debt and desperate schemes. Julian represented everything Fletcher aspired to be but never could. Old money, real power, success that didn't depend on crushing other people. Get out of my house, he said finally, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. Gladly, I replied, and headed for the stairs to pack my things. You'll be back, Fletcher called after me, loud enough that his voice echoed off the marble floors and cold walls of the house that had never felt like home. When you realize that Julian doesn't want a 57-year-old housewife, when you figure out that you can't survive in the real world without someone taking care of you, you'll come crawling back. And maybe, if you ask nicely enough, I'll consider taking you back. I paused on the staircase and looked down at my husband of 25 years. This man who had systematically isolated me from everyone I loved, who had spent 3 decades lying to me about Julian's attempts to find me, who honestly believed that I was too weak and too damaged to exist without his control. No, Fletcher, I said quietly. I won't be back. Because whatever happens with Julian, whatever happens with the job or the future or any of it, I finally understand something important. I would rather be alone for the rest of my life than spend one more day with someone who sees me as a possession instead of a person. As I climbed the stairs to pack my clothes, I could hear Fletcher behind me, already on the phone with someone, his voice rising and falling in angry explanation. Probably calling his lawyer or his business manager or one of the other men who helped him maintain the illusion of success and respectability. But for the first time in 25 years, I wasn't listening to Fletcher Morrison's voice with fear or anxiety or the need to please. I was listening to it the way you listen to background noise, something irrelevant that would soon fade away entirely. I had a phone call to make, a job to accept, and a life to reclaim. And it was starting right now. I called Julian from my car in the parking lot of a hotel downtown, my hands still shaking from the confrontation with Fletcher. The sun was setting over the Denver skyline, painting the mountains in shades of gold and purple that reminded me of the evenings Julian and I used to spend studying together on the university campus, when the future seemed limitless and love felt strong enough to overcome any obstacle. "Maureen?" Julian answered on the first ring, as if he had been waiting by the phone. "Are you all right? You sound upset." "I'm leaving him," I said without preamble, my voice steadier than I felt. "Fletcher, I'm leaving him tonight, and I want to accept your job offer." There was a moment of silence, then Julian's voice came through warm and sure. "Where are you?" "The Marriott downtown. I couldn't think of anywhere else to go." "Stay there. I'll be right over." 20 minutes later, I watched through the hotel lobby windows as Julian's black BMW pulled up to the valet stand. He emerged wearing jeans and a simple gray sweater, looking more like the college boy I had fallen in love with than the powerful CEO who commanded boardrooms and million-dollar deals. When he spotted me sitting in one of the lobby's leather chairs, his face lit up with a mixture of relief and something deeper: hope. "Are you hurt?" he asked, sitting down beside me and immediately noticing the bruises on my arm where Fletcher had grabbed me. His jaw tightened with controlled anger. "Did he put his hands on you?" "Nothing I can't handle," I said, though we both knew that wasn't really true. Fletcher's abuse had been psychological for so long that the physical component felt like a natural escalation, not a shocking departure from his usual behavior. Julian reached out carefully, gently touching the purple marks on my forearm. "No one should ever put their hands on you in anger, Maureen. No one." The tenderness in his voice, the careful way he examined the bruises as if they were wounds he could heal through sheer force of will, made tears spring to my eyes. I had forgotten what it felt like to be treated with genuine concern, to have someone care about my pain instead of dismissing it as weakness or melodrama. "Tell me what happened," Julian said quietly. So I did. I told him about Fletcher's revelation that he had known about Julian's search for 30 years, about the systematic sabotage of every investigation, about the threats and manipulation that had kept us apart. Julian listened with growing incredulity and rage, his hands clenched into fists as the full scope of Fletcher's deception became clear. 30 years, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. 30 years of wondering if you ever thought about me, if you ever regretted leaving. 30 years of believing that maybe I hadn't fought hard enough for you, that maybe you really had stopped loving me. "I never stopped loving you," I said, the words tumbling out before I could stop them. "Not for one day in 30 years. I married Fletcher because I was broken and alone, but I never stopped carrying you in my heart." Julian turned to face me fully, his dark eyes searching my face. "And now, after everything that's happened, after all the time that's passed, what do you want now, Maureen?" It was the question I had been afraid to answer, even to myself. What did I want from this impossible situation? This second chance that felt like a gift and a test rolled into one. "I want to find out who I am when I'm not afraid," I said honestly. "I want to discover what my life could look like if I'm making the choices instead of having them made for me. And I want to find out if what we had was real enough to survive everything that's happened to us." Julian smiled, the first genuine smile I had seen from him since that moment of recognition at the gala. "Then let's find out together." The next morning, I walked into the offices of Blackwood Industries as Julian's new director of community relations, a position he had created specifically for me that would utilize my background in literature and education to develop partnerships with local schools and literacy programs. It was meaningful work, the kind of job I had always dreamed of having, and the salary Julian offered was more than Fletcher's monthly allowance multiplied by 12. $2,500 a week, he had said when we discussed the position over dinner the night before. Plus benefits, vacation time, and complete autonomy over your department. I want you to have financial independence, Maureen. I want you to never again be dependent on someone else's generosity for your basic needs. The money was more than I had ever imagined earning, enough to rent my own apartment, buy my own car, make my own choices about how to spend my time and resources. But more than the financial freedom, the job represented something I had thought was lost forever. The chance to be valued for my mind instead of my compliance, my ideas instead of my silence. Julian's assistant, Rebecca, welcomed me warmly and gave me a tour of the offices, introducing me to department heads and explaining the company's various community outreach initiatives. Everyone was professional and friendly, treating me like a valued colleague rather than the boss's personal project. By the end of my first day, I felt more energized and purposeful than I had in decades. But Fletcher wasn't finished with his attempts to control the narrative. 3 days into my new job, Julian called me into his office with a grim expression. "We need to talk," he said, closing the door behind me. "Fletcher's been busy." He handed me a legal document, thick with official seals and threatening language. Fletcher was suing me for alienation of affection, claiming that Julian had deliberately interfered with our marriage and seeking financial damages for the destruction of our relationship. It was an archaic legal concept, rarely used in modern divorce proceedings, but Fletcher had found lawyers willing to pursue it. He's also filed for an injunction to freeze any joint assets until the divorce is finalized, Julian continued. "Bank accounts, credit cards, even the car you've been driving. He's trying to cut off your access to everything." I sank into the chair across from Julian's desk, feeling the familiar weight of Fletcher's manipulation settling over me like a suffocating blanket. Even when I tried to escape his control, he found new ways to trap me, new methods to remind me of my dependence on his generosity. "He wants me to come crawling back," I said quietly. "He thinks if he can make me desperate enough, scared enough, I'll give up and return to him." Julian sat on the edge of his desk, close enough that I could see the determination burning in his dark eyes. "Then he doesn't know you very well. But Maureen, there's something else. Something that might change the entire situation." He pulled out another set of documents, these ones bearing the letterhead of a prestigious downtown law firm. I had my lawyers do some investigating into Fletcher's business practices, particularly his real estate investments over the past decade. "It turns out your husband has been playing some very dangerous games with other people's money." I looked at the papers, trying to make sense of the legal language and financial terminology. "What kind of games?" "The kind that could land him in federal prison," Julian said grimly. "Fletcher's been using his development company as a shell for money laundering operations. Dirty money from various sources gets invested in his real estate projects, comes out clean on the other side. The FBI has been building a case against him for months." The words hit me like a physical blow. Fletcher, for all his faults, had always seemed like a legitimate businessman, if not a particularly successful one. The idea that he was involved in criminal activity felt surreal, like discovering that the man I had lived with for 25 years was actually a stranger. "How long have you known about this?" I asked. "I suspected something was wrong with his finances when I started researching his company for potential contracts," Julian admitted. "The numbers didn't add up. The funding sources were questionable. But I didn't have proof until my lawyer started digging deeper." I stared at the documents, understanding the implications of what Julian was telling me. If Fletcher was arrested for money laundering, His assets would be frozen, his business would be shut down, and any claims he had against me in the divorce would become irrelevant. But it also meant that the man I had married, however unhappily, was a criminal who had been using our home and our marriage as cover for illegal activities. "What do we do?" I asked. Julian's expression was carefully neutral, but I could see the protectiveness in his eyes, the same fierce determination that had driven him to search for me for 30 years. "We do nothing. The FBI will do their job, and Fletcher will face the consequences of his choices. But Maureen, you need to understand, when this comes out, and it will come out soon, there's going to be a lot of media attention. Your marriage to Fletcher will be scrutinized. Your connection to me will be public knowledge. It's going to be uncomfortable for a while." I thought about the house I had shared with Fletcher, the marble floors and expensive furniture that had apparently been purchased with laundered money. I thought about the charity galas we had attended, the business associates we had entertained, all of it part of Fletcher's elaborate facade of respectability. How much of our life together had been built on lies I never knew were being told. "I don't care about the media attention," I said finally. "I care about doing the right thing. And the right thing is letting the truth come out, whatever that means for Fletcher or for me." Julian nodded, something like pride flickering across his face. The woman I fell in love with 30 years ago would have said exactly the same thing. 2 weeks later, Fletcher Morrison was arrested at his office on charges of money laundering, fraud, and tax evasion. The local news media covered the story extensively, focusing on the dramatic fall of a prominent Denver businessman and the millions of dollars in illegal transactions that had funded his real estate empire. Our divorce proceedings became a footnote to the larger criminal case, with Fletcher's lawyers too busy trying to keep him out of federal prison to pursue harassment lawsuits against me. I watched the news coverage from Julian's penthouse apartment, where I had been staying since leaving the hotel. It felt surreal to see Fletcher in handcuffs, being led away from the office building where he had conducted business for decades. This man who had controlled every aspect of my life for 25 years looked small and frightened on television, no longer the intimidating figure who had dominated our marriage. "How do you feel?" Julian asked, sitting beside me on the sofa as the news anchor moved on to other stories. "Free," I said, surprising myself with the honesty of the answer. "For the first time in decades, I feel completely free." Julian reached over and took my hand, our fingers interlacing naturally. "Free to do what?" I looked at this man who had loved me for 30 years, who had given me a job and financial independence, and the chance to discover who I was when I wasn't afraid. I thought about the emerald ring hidden in my purse, the symbol of promises we had made when we were young, and believed that love could conquer anything. Maybe it could. "Free to find out if it's possible to fall in love with the same person twice," I said softly. Julian's smile was answer enough. 8 months later, I stood in front of the mirror in the bridal suite at the Four Seasons, adjusting the simple ivory dress I had chosen for my second wedding. It was nothing like the elaborate gown I had worn when I married Fletcher. No train, no veil, no desperate attempt to convince myself that expensive fabric could transform a marriage of convenience into a love story. This dress was elegant in its simplicity, perfect for a woman who had finally learned the difference between settling and choosing. "You look beautiful, sweetheart," said Margaret, Julian's assistant who had become my closest friend over the past months. She was fastening a string of pearls around my neck, something borrowed from her own jewelry collection, continuing a tradition I had never properly observed the first time around. The pearls caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through the suite's windows, and for a moment I was transported back to my college days, when Julian and I used to spend lazy Sunday mornings in his apartment, reading the newspaper and planning our future together. We had been so young then, so certain that love was the only ingredient necessary for a happy ending. Now, at 58, I understood that love was just the beginning, the foundation upon which you built trust, respect, partnership, and the 1,000 small choices that created a life worth sharing. "Are you nervous?" Margaret asked, stepping back to admire her handiwork. Excited, I corrected, and realized it was true. When I married Fletcher 30 years ago, I had been numb with grief and desperate for security. Today, I was marrying Julian because I chose to, because I wanted to spend whatever years I had left with the man who had loved me faithfully through 3 decades of separation. A soft knock on the door interrupted my thoughts. "Come in," I called, expecting to see the wedding coordinator or perhaps Julian's sister Catherine, who had flown in from Boston for the ceremony. Instead, Julian himself stepped into the room, looking devastatingly handsome in his charcoal gray suit. Margaret made a disapproving sound in her throat. "Julian Blackwood, you know you're not supposed to see the bride before the ceremony," she scolded. "It's bad luck." Julian's eyes never left my face as he smiled at Margaret's protest. "After 30 years of bad luck, I think Maureen and I are due for some good fortune. Besides, I have something that belongs to her." He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small velvet box, the same one I remembered from our engagement 31 years ago. When he opened it, his grandmother's emerald ring caught the light exactly the way it had beside that campus lake, when we were young and believed that promises made with tears of joy were unbreakable. "I believe this is yours," Julian said softly, taking my left hand in his. "It's been waiting for you to come home." I had given him back the ring in that coffee shop 3 decades ago, thinking I was protecting both our futures by walking away. Now, as he slipped it onto my finger where it belonged, I understood that some promises were stronger than the forces that tried to break them. Some love was patient enough to wait 30 years for a second chance. "It still fits," I whispered, watching the emerald catch the afternoon light. "Some things are meant to be," Julian replied, lifting my hand to kiss the ring gently. Margaret dabbed at her eyes with a tissue, muttering about hormonal responses to romantic gestures, but she was smiling as she ushered Julian toward the door. "Out," she commanded. "The bride needs 5 more minutes, and you need to get to the altar before your guests start wondering if you've changed your mind." Julian paused in the doorway, looking back at me with the same expression he had worn at the gala 8 months ago. Wonder mixed with gratitude, as if he still couldn't quite believe I was real. "I'll be the one waiting at the end of the aisle," he said quietly. "I know," I replied. "You've been waiting for 30 years. After he left, I took one final look at myself in the mirror. The woman staring back at me looked older than the 22-year-old bride who had married Fletcher, but she also looked stronger, more certain, more genuinely happy than I had ever seen her before. This wasn't a woman settling for security or running from grief. This was a woman who had fought her way back to love and was brave enough to claim it. The ceremony took place in the hotel's garden, overlooking the mountains that had served as the backdrop for Julian's and my college romance. 50 guests sat in white chairs arranged between rose bushes and flowering trees, friends and colleagues who had welcomed me into Julian's world with warmth and genuine affection. It was everything Fletcher's and my wedding hadn't been: intimate, joyful, focused on celebration rather than status. As I walked down the petal-strewn path, I saw Julian waiting for me at the altar, his face radiant with happiness. Beside him stood his best man David, his college roommate who had helped him search for me during those early years after our breakup. I had met David the previous month and learned that Julian had talked about me constantly during their university days, that even after our separation, Julian had kept hoping I would change my mind and come back to him. "He never stopped believing that you were meant for each other," David had told me over dinner. "Even when he married Catherine, even during the divorce, he always said that if he could find you again, he would spend the rest of his life making up for lost time." Now, as I reached the altar and Julian took my hands in his, I could see that promise reflected in his eyes. We had lost 30 years to other people's manipulations and our own youthful fears, but we had the rest of our lives to create new memories, to build the partnership we had dreamed of when we were students with more hope than money. The ceremony was brief and deeply personal. Instead of generic vows, Julian and I had written our own words, promises that acknowledged the pain of our separation and the miracle of our reunion. When Julian spoke about loving me through 30 years of absence, about never giving up hope that we would find our way back to each other, there wasn't a dry eye among our guests. "I promise to never let fear make decisions for us again," I said when it was my turn to speak. "I promise to trust that love is worth fighting for, worth choosing every day, worth believing in even when it seems impossible." When the minister pronounced us husband and wife, Julian kissed me with 30 years of pent-up longing and gratitude. The garden erupted in applause and joyful laughter, but all I could hear was my own heartbeat and Julian's whispered "finally" against my lips. The reception was held in the hotel's ballroom, the same space where Fletcher and I had attended countless business functions over the years, pretending to be a happy couple while maintaining the careful emotional distance that had defined our marriage. Tonight, that ballroom was transformed into something magical. Candlelit tables, soft jazz music, and the kind of genuine celebration that happens when people gather to witness real love. During our first dance, Julian and I swayed to the same song we had danced to at our senior prom 31 years ago. "The way you look tonight," with its promise of enduring love and timeless beauty, felt prophetic now in a way it hadn't then. "Any regrets?" Julian asked as we moved together, his arms strong and certain around me. "Only one," I said, smiling up at him. "I regret that we lost 30 years, but I don't regret the path that led us back to each other. Without everything we've been through, I might not appreciate how precious this is." Julian spun me gently, and I caught a glimpse of our guests watching us with the kind of satisfaction that comes from witnessing a long-overdue happy ending. Margaret was dancing with David, tears of joy still visible on her cheeks. Catherine, Julian's sister, was deep in conversation with several of my new colleagues from Blackwood Industries, all of them treating me like family, rather than the boss's new wife. After the formal dances ended, Julian and I stepped onto the hotel's terrace for a few moments of quiet together. The Denver skyline sparkled below us, and in the distance, the mountains stood silhouetted against the star-filled sky. It was the same view I had admired during my college years, when Julian and I used to drive into the foothills to study and dream about our future together. "Do you remember what we used to say about those mountains?" Julian asked, following my gaze. I smiled at the memory. That they had been there for millions of years, and they would be there for millions more. That some things were permanent, even when everything else felt temporary. "Like us," Julian said simply. "Like this." He pulled out his phone and showed me a photograph he had taken during the ceremony. The moment when I walked down the aisle toward him, my face glowing with happiness and certainty. In the background, the mountains rose majestically, eternal witnesses to our second chance at love. "I want to remember this moment exactly as it is," Julian said. "I want to remember how it feels to finally have everything I've ever wanted." As we stood together on that terrace, surrounded by the celebration of our love and the promise of our shared future, I thought about Fletcher serving his sentence in federal prison, about the house I had shared with him now empty and awaiting sale by government assets recovery. I felt no vindictive satisfaction at his downfall, only a quiet gratitude that his lies and manipulations were no longer my burden to carry. I thought about Charles Blackwood, Julian's father, who had died 5 years earlier, still believing that he had successfully separated his son from an unsuitable woman. He had never lived to see Julian and me reunited, had never been forced to confront the failure of his cruel machinations. Perhaps that was justice enough. Most of all, I thought about the woman I had been 8 months ago, trapped, controlled, convinced that safety was more important than happiness. She felt like a stranger now, someone I remembered with compassion but no longer recognized as myself. The woman I had become was stronger, braver, more willing to fight for what mattered. She was someone I was proud to be. "What are you thinking about?" Julian asked, noticing my contemplative expression. "The future," I said honestly. "Our future." All the mornings we'll wake up together, all the decisions we'll make as partners instead of strangers sharing a house. All the years we have left to love each other properly. Julian lifted my left hand to his lips, kissing the emerald ring that had finally found its way home. 58 isn't too late for a new beginning, is it? I looked at my husband, my true husband, the man I had chosen with my whole heart instead of accepting out of necessity, and felt the last vestiges of fear and doubt fall away like autumn leaves. 58 is exactly the right time, I said. We're finally old enough to know what love actually means, and young enough to enjoy it for a very long time. As we rejoined our reception, dancing and laughing with the people who had become our chosen family, I realized that some stories don't end with the first, I do. Sometimes they begin there, with second chances and hard-won wisdom, and the understanding that real love is worth waiting for, worth fighting for, worth choosing again and again until you get it right. Julian and I had gotten it right at last, and we had the rest of our lives to celebrate that miracle. Now I'm curious about you who listened to my story. What would you do if you were in my place? Have you ever been through something similar? Comment below, and meanwhile, I'm leaving on the final screen 2 other stories that are channel favorites, and they will definitely surprise you. Thank you for watching until here.